Well, thank you. It is great to be here. Do you ever get a pang of conscience after you've done something kind of crappy, or you've just made some cutting remark for no good reason, and then you maybe look around at what's happening in the world, you've seen the latest news about the recent atrocity, and you think, maybe the human species is not all that it's cracked up to be. Or maybe you have just the opposite reaction. You're startled by acts of generosity and courage and self-sacrifice. Well, today we are going to take the moral temperature of our fellow human beings and of ourselves, and we're going to talk about some old-fashioned ideas like virtue and character and what they mean for our own lives. Now, for centuries, philosophers and religious leaders were the go-to authorities on morality, but more recently, science has gotten into the act. Now, there are evolutionary explanations for all kinds of moral behaviors, and there's a whole new wing of neuroscience that looks at how particular parts of our brain seem to trigger behaviors that have a moral component, from compassion and sociability to impulsivity and violence. So one question is how much science can tell us about morality. And even if it can point to the roots of certain behaviors, does this knowledge actually make us better people? Or to ask the question in another way, if we're looking for virtue, are we better off talking to scientists or philosophers? And we have both on our panel this evening, so you can be the judge. We're going to dig into the science of morality and also concepts like character and the good life and what it all means for our lives, and we have a wonderful panel. So let me introduce our speakers. Heather Berlin is a cognitive neuroscientist and assistant professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. She received her PhD from the University of Oxford and MPH from Harvard University. She studies the complex interactions of the human brain and mind with the goal of better treatment and prevention of impulsive and compulsive psychiatric disorders. She's also interested in the neural basis of consciousness and dynamic unconscious processes, and is a visiting scholar at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. Christian Miller is professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University. He holds a BA in philosophy from Princeton University and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. His main areas of research are metaethics, moral psychology, moral character, action theory, and philosophy of religion. He's the director of the Character Project and the author of Moral Character and Empirical Theory and Character and Moral Psychology, which together articulate a novel framework for thinking about character that is empirically supported by research in psychology. And Michael Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, a monthly columnist for Scientific American, and a presidential fellow at Chapman University. He received his BA in psychology from Pepperdine University, his MA in experimental psychology from California State University, Fullerton, and his PhD in the history of science from Claremont Graduate University. His most recent book is The Moral Arc: How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. And his other books include Why Darwin Matters and The Science of Good and Evil. Thank you, and welcome. So let me explain our format. We're going to be...
Thank you. Good night. Wow.
We'll be talking for, 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we will throw it open to questions from the audience. And Christian, I want to start with you. I came across an essay you wrote about your 3-year-old son who was peppering you with all those why questions, like, Daddy, why should I be a good boy? And in writing about this, you said, the question of why be good is important because most of us, myself included, are simply not good, morally speaking. We do not have a virtuous or good character. Why do you say that?
Sorry to be a downer right at the beginning, but I do say that not because, well, there might be several reasons to say that. I might just look at my own introspective character and think about what I'm like. I might read the news and see all the kind of depressing events that are going on in the news today. I might look throughout human history and see the chronicle of atrocities that have been committed in various places throughout the world. But the real reason I come to that conclusion is on the basis of scientific research. And specifically, the scientific research that I focus on is psychological research done in the last 50 years. So when I look at very carefully done psychological experiments that have some moral implications, I say to myself, okay, is this the kind of behavior that I'm observing these studies that I would expect of a good person, of a virtuous person. And time again, I don't find that borne out in the studies. So to make it,
give me an example of that.
More concrete. Here's a really dramatic example, and then here's a little simpler example. The really dramatic example that everyone's going to be familiar with is the Milgram experiments from the 1960s. So I presume most of you are familiar with this very famous research in which you would take ordinary people, bring them into a lab, and in the upshot, in the course of about 20 or 30 minutes, you could get them to voluntarily kill an innocent person. Now, let's say a little bit more about that, and then I'll give you the other study. So what happened is you bring this person into the lab, you say, I want you to administer a test to someone who's in the next room. And for every wrong answer that this person gets, I want you to turn this dial up a little bit more and administer, the dial is going to give a little shock every time there's a wrong answer. And the more wrong answers, the more you have to turn the dial up, and the more shock this person's going to get. And as it goes along, it's all, of course, rigged. This is all staged. There really is no shock going on. The person in the other room is an actor, but the participant doesn't know that. They think it's real. And so as time goes on, there are more and more wrong answers, and so there's more pressure to turn the dial up. And the dial has numbers on it, and the final reading is XXX, the lethal dosage of shock. And lo and behold, what happens? Well, before I tell you that, add another wrinkle into it. There was the participant, there was a person in the other room, and then there was a scientific-looking individual in a lab coat who was in the room with the participants. And anytime there was any kind of squeamishness or objection or something like that, this scientific-looking person would say, please continue. You must go on. We need these results. And the upshot was 66% typically would end up turning the dial all the way to the XXX level and killing, so they thought, this test taker in the other room. Despite earlier the test taker screaming in pain, pounding on the walls, saying, I have a heart condition, it didn't matter. The dial was turned up all the way to the XXX level. So the underlying idea, and I'll try and wrap it up, sorry, is that powerful impetus to obey an authority figure led these ordinary participants to voluntarily kill an innocent person. That doesn't sound too good to me. I don't know what you think about that. That doesn't sound too good to me.
I'm going to come back in a moment, and we can get your other example. But, but Heather, what do you think?
Just sort of not a counter argument, but I guess a caveat. I mean, the thing that I think that this study, I mean, it was looking at obedience to authority and how, and there's a couple of points here. Not everybody did it, right? So what did you say? It was 66%, right? So, there's a lot of things, a lot of psychological aspects to what goes into when and when not to obey authority. And there are people who have varying degrees in which they do obey. And so I don't think that this study in particular is a great example of saying that we are innately immoral. I just think that some of us are more, vulnerable to authority than others. There, to counter-argue that, there's these studies by Karen Wynn at Yale with children looking at babies having to sort of make moral decisions, and they're looking at puppets, and one puppet is sort of a bad puppet, which kind of doesn't help out the puppet in the middle, and the other one is a good one that does help them out. And then afterwards, these 3-month-old babies can choose which stuffed animal they want to play with, and 90% of the time they go with the good one. And then when they're offered cookies by the good and the bad one, and the bad one has more cookies than the good one, they'll still take the one cookie from the good one. So there are these, if you're talking about innate morality, at such a young age, at 3 months old, they're making these, morally sort of good decisions. So I think that's just a counter argument.
I like the one where the baby slapped the bad puppet.
So Michael, do you want to weigh in here? Are we more innately good or bad?
I did a replication of Milgram's experiments here in New York with Chris Hansen, and I did this for Dateline NBC. We did 7 subjects. We just had one day in this rented studio. And it was a faux reality television show. It's really easy to get people in New York to participate in what they think is going to be on TV. Anyway, so actually, what we saw in our subject, we actually built exactly the Milgram shock box with the toggle switches, 15 volts at a time. and so on. But what you saw in every one of our first subject, this woman said "You're going to do what? I'm out of here." And then the other 6 went various degrees up, but they were really not happy about this. They were anxious about it. You could tell that their heart rates were elevated. They were struggling all the way. Are you sure? I really don't want to do this. I'm really uncomfortable with this. Can we go check on him? That you could see that they had a moral sense, all of them. And so really another way to just rephrase it is like, we have a good nature that you can twist and make go in a different direction under certain conditions.
Well, it also makes me wonder if you just did this experiment recently, and what year was the Milgram? 60s. I mean, maybe we've become a lot more skeptical about authority.
The only guy to actually replicate it legally, because we didn't have to get the approval of a research board. We just had to get the approval of NBC lawyers to say it's okay. We won't get sued and have the subject sign all these waivers. Anyway, but Jerry Berger at Portland State did it up to 150 volts, which was the point at which, in Milgram's original experiments, the subjects would bail out or not, or go all the way. And he found a lower percentage of participants that went that far. And so maybe that's a little bit of the bending of the moral arc. There's also the effect that who hasn't heard of the Milgram experiments? I was amazed at the subjects we had. They were younger, so maybe they hadn't had that class yet or something like that.
Well, let me.
But the way to phrase it is that instead of is it nature, nurture, are we good or evil? We're both. Yes, we have a great range of capacity, and how you tweak the variables, the dials, the social conditions in which you put somebody, you can get them to do bad or good. I mean, there's studies of the Nazi Einsatzgruppen and these special action forces in the East after the Wehrmacht went through to the invasion of the Soviet Union. And their job, these special action forces, was to kill all the Jews in every one of these towns. And it turns out this was not an easy task for the leaders to get the soldiers to do. They had to introduce them at long range and then close range. And many of the men got sick, violently ill. They didn't want to do it. And they had to impose a lot of conditions to get them to go all the way. Now, yes, of course, there's some that enthusiastically did it, but most, they weren't super comfortable doing it. They had that sense of, I shouldn't be doing this, but here's a bunch of conditions that say it's okay. And then with habituation, you can get them to do it a lot more.
And also rationalization. I mean, a lot of times, I think even the Nazi leaders who were doing it, willingly and whatnot, were believing. I mean, if you even take, the terrorists now, there is this conviction that I am doing the right thing in their mind. So it's not.
That's right. They think they're being moral, not immoral.
Yes,
So
exactly.
and Christian, you wanted to jump in here?
So I threw out something provocative. Let me now kind of backtrack a little bit. So don't label me as holding this real extreme view just based on one study. So let me give a little bit more nuanced picture of what I'm thinking. So a couple of quick side notes first. A recent replication of Milgram we funded through the Character Project used a virtual reality simulation of the Milgram study. And so we could recreate the whole thing, but with a virtual reality avatar as the test taker as opposed to a real person. Found the same kind of pattern of results. Very interesting research. We also funded research on young children finding the same kind of fairness dispositions and tendencies, wanting to play with fair people as opposed to unfair people, even at 9 months old. So I agree with that too. My overall view is not that because we're not good, that means we're kind of wretched people, vicious people, horrendous people. So I want to don't jump to that conclusion. I think I agree with what's been said here. It's a much more of a balanced picture. So I don't think the Milgram experiments, for example, show that we are vicious. Why? Here's one reason. A vicious person, according to Aristotle, is someone who is wholehearted, single-minded in pursuing something. But as this particular study, as you mentioned, showed, people were of two minds about it. They were kind of conflicted and torn, and they felt a lot of guilt about it. So that's one reason. But then there are all these really powerful studies pointing in the opposite direction. So not that we're just going to do these kind of problematic things, morally speaking, but that we're also, in other situations, quite disposed to do morally tremendous things, powerful things, and for admirable motives too, because motivation is really important to moral behavior, not just, to the evaluation of a person and to someone's character, not just their action. So research on empathy, done by Dan Batson and others, I find it very convincing in showing that we, in addition to kind of aggressive capacities and other problematic capacities, we also have empathetic capacities to help others for selfless, altruistic reasons.
So I want to back up for a moment here. So where do our moral inclinations come from? I mean, is this hardwired into our evolutionary history?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How so?
Well, because if you just take, like, the selfish gene model, we should just be maximizing our utility and selfishly hoarding all the resources. If I do that, you have the same motive. And so we're going to have a conflict. So it's actually better for me if I don't do that. If I actually be nice to you and you be nice to me, we both benefit.
There's reciprocity.
There's reciprocity. So Bob Trivers and others worked this out in the 60s and 70s, the mathematics of kin selection and reciprocal altruism. So we can get out to your kin and kind of why we would be nice to people who are either genetically related to us or we spend a lot of time with them because there's going to be payback and so on. So the idea is that we evolve these emotions. Emotions are proxies to drive behavior. So you have the emotion of lust to drive you to have sex to propagate the species. Love to lead to pair bonding with oxytocin and dopamine and all that good stuff, so that you have a longer-term commitment to raise slow-growing offspring and so on. You have jealousy for mate guarding. You have anger, so that if somebody does try to exploit, if you try to exploit me, I'm going to pop you in the nose, and then you're less likely to do it next time. And therefore, cultivating a reputation of being a badass, like, you better not mess with me, because if you do, I'm going to come. Okay, all right. Let's be nice to Shermer because, okay. And then revenge. The idea of revenge is important, so that you're not exploited, because there are bullies. There are people that, on the spectrum of, toward the darker end. So we have to deal with bullies really by being hard asses about it.
So you're saying that morality, our moral instincts it's their emotional responses. They probably are originating at some unconscious level. It's not a matter of, we're sort of trying to reason this out and what should I do? Is this the right thing or is that the right thing? You're saying that's usually not the way we make moral decisions?
It's layered. So the moral emotions, the sentiments, what we're born with, what we get, that starts at 3 months. Mm-hmm. That comes with the package with everything else. I mean, the moralization sense is certainly one of the most important characteristics of being human. And if you look at police blotters, 90% of homicides are moralistic in nature. The guy scratched my car. He insulted me in front of my girlfriend. He stole. He insulted me, and this kind of thing. Or, the ISIS people. They're doing. The West is evil. We have to strike back. They're moralistic in nature. Very few homicides are instrumental. When a burglar burgles your home, they don't want you to be home. They'd rather you weren't home, because they don't want to fight. They don't want to. They want to maximize their utility by getting your stuff with the least amount of violence as possible. It's why pirates fly the Jolly Roger skull and crossbones flag. It's a costly signal that says, we are badasses and we're coming to take your stuff, so you should just give it to us without a fight. And that's what the flag did. Now, every once in a while, you have to actually do it, so that people know this guy is a real badass, right?
So Heather, how much do you think science can explain our moral inclinations?
Well, I think there's a lot. Evolution. There's a lot of great explanations about why we behave the way we do because of evolution. But we're also born. There's individual differences, and we have these innate impulses, these innate desires to, let's say, go for immediate pleasure, immediate reward, right? And these are structures deeper in our brain, evolutionarily older structures, like your reptilian brain, that are driving you for. So, let's say to procreate. Okay, you have the drive. I want to rape that person, right? Then you have a more recently developed prefrontal cortex, thinks about the future consequences of your actions, and says, you know what? Maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe reputation management. Like, people will behave more immorally when nobody's watching than if they think they're going to be talked about, and that's why all these things now, like. Bottom-up kind of reputation things like Uber or everything, Facebook. Now it's like we are forcing each other to behave in more moral ways because people are going to talk about us and we want to be liked, and that gives us resources. So all that is kind of getting into it, but there are individual differences in terms of how much a person has the capacity to control those innate reptilian drives to immediate pleasure or avoidance of pain. If you're just following those, Freud would call them your id impulses, then a person would not necessarily behave in the most moral way. And that's why teenagers, for example, like your prefrontal cortex, the kind of brake system that thinks about the future consequences of your actions, it's not fully developed until about the age of 25. And so they have much more difficulty, not acting on impulse, not acting on those drives. And just like that, there's a certain modification in the genome that affects serotonin receptors in the brain. And people who have a certain shorter allele for the serotonin receptor will end up acting out more impulsively. They can't control their impulses. Now, if you're looking at making moral decisions, this all plays into it. So it's not just about how we've evolved as a species. There really are individual differences in how a person has the capacity to make moral decisions, how they're not just overwhelmed either by their emotions or lack of emotions.
So are there certain aspects of our morality that science simply cannot explain, Christian?
I guess I'll be provocative tonight. I don't think, strictly speaking, science can explain any aspect of morality. So that's very.
You didn't read my book yet.
Sorry. Oh no, I'm in trouble now. So I say that very carefully. Sure, science can give us lots of insights into explaining why certain people did this action as opposed to this action, whether certain people are capable of this as opposed to that. But when I think about morality, I'm thinking about the prescriptive, the ethical, the normative. I'm thinking about do not lie, with some exceptions. Do not cheat, do not steal, help others in need. And these are principles and rules or guidelines that tell us what we ought to do, what we should do. And to my simple-minded mind, that's not something that I'm going to be able to learn directly from scientific investigation.
But isn't it just like, there's moral relativism, so like there's no, I mean, maybe you think there is, but I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule of that these are these moral things that exist out there. And, and so in that sense.
Sure. So first of all, in the philosophical world, moral relativism is one view. It's very controversial still. And surprisingly, actually, most philosophers reject moral relativism. This is a kind of interesting sociological observation about philosophy. Either because they think morality is grounded in a higher being, a divine being, or because they're quite comfortable talking about morality just being objective and existing on its own, without a creator, as a objective feature of reality, just like the laws of physics or the laws of nature in general. So we can get into that debate about whether morality is objective or relative. But even if you think about morality in a more relative way, presumably you think according to your moral code, certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Certain things are good or bad. So whatever that happens to be, those moral principles relative to your moral code are not going to be such that you can just read them off the scientific results.
No, are you saying that the basis of that moral code is cultural, or is it personal? Is it just something that each of us comes up with?
So at the end of the day, each of us has to make a personal decision as to what moral code we're going to hold. But there's a further question of where morality comes from as a matter of fact. So some people think morality comes from a divine being. A divine being just lays out a moral code for us to follow. In fact, that's probably the predominant view in the West and throughout our history has been kind of divine command theory where God's in charge of morality. Others think that the deeper truth about morality, as I said, is just that there is a natural law or a set of moral truths that we are able to tap into using either a conscience or our reason. And we can judge our moral opinions as true or false in light of that more basic code. Or there's this more cultural view which says morality is just a product of the particular culture we live in. There's a kind of American morality, there's ISIS morality, there's these different moralities, and there's no one true morality or correct morality beyond just what different cultures subscribe to.
Okay, so Michael, I want you to jump in here.
Well, I was going to ask which one do you believe?
When I teach Introduction to Philosophy, I never share my own views. I always keep trying to be as neutral as possible and present the different
We're
positions.
the graduate class here.
But since it's a little different context than my intro class.
No microaggressions here, or else you're going to be in big trouble.
So I promised my intro class I would not tell my views, and they're taking the final exam this week. So maybe I should stick to my policy. No, my own view is the divine view. So I think morality is objective in virtue of being created by a divine being. Now,
which one?
So I don't know how much we want to go down this path, but I'm perfectly comfortable doing
all right.
so.
Would you say it's objectively that a culture that grants women equal rights is a better culture than a culture that suppresses women's rights, doesn't let them drive, forces them to wear a veil, practices female genital? Would you say that they're objectively really better?
Yes.
Yes. And where is that in any holy book?
Yeah. So here, why don't we have a two-part discussion? First part, I think that kind of question leads us towards objective morality. I think we're on
That's the whole idea.
That's the same. We're on the same page there. That moral relativism is problematic for precisely these kind of reasons. One culture has this kind of code, another has this very, very different code, and I have a hard time thinking that those two codes are equally valid. That there's no better moral code on those when it comes to examples like that.
Well, I mean, this is fascinating because I mean, it sounds like you're kind of ending up in the same place.
Yeah,
although
but I'm gonna
you come at it from totally different
Yeah,
perspectives.
because where are you getting this idea? You're not getting this from any holy book that I know of.
So,
Unless you're getting it from divine inspiration or something. I think you're getting it from Western culture and the rights revolutions, from the Enlightenment all the way to last week.
yeah, so I'm not dodging the question. I'll answer it directly in a moment, but I just want to first backed up to the earlier point. This kind of discussion we're having, this kind of debate, I don't think you can read this off of science, first of all. Secondly, I think there's good reason to go from a relativist view to an objectivist view. So it looks like we have some common ground there. Thirdly, where then can we ground our objective view? That takes us into a discussion, I think, of philosophy, religion, and questions about that. So my own view is principles like love your neighbor as yourself, where your neighbor extends to all human beings, could take us in the direction of ascribing equal rights to men and women.
Well, Michael, I want to come back to you because, I mean, you're saying that science, evolution in particular, can explain a lot about our moral impulses. But if we want to talk about rights, if we want to talk about sort of the emergence of all these rights that we've particularly seen in the last couple of centuries, does science really explain that? It would seem that would seem to be something that's happened culturally, that's not about science.
That's chapter 3 of the moral argument. Basically, my argument is that the kinds of things we're talking about, how do we structure a society with rules and laws and economic systems and political systems in a way that suppresses the inner demons and brings out the better angels, that sort of like tweaking the Milgram experiment a little bit. Like, for example, if Milgram had somebody else in the room that refused to go on, then the real subject was also more likely to refuse to go on. If you force the person to put their hand down on the electric grid, then almost everybody refused to go on. So we know that if we structure society in a way that people are more connected, they have more, say, participation in society through a democracy than an autocracy. These are the kinds of things we've discovered empirically by running experiments for 200 years. And maybe you don't call that science. I call it science. It's social science.
Sure. I call it science.
Yeah, and that's, so empirically, you just ask people, what would you like? Would you prefer to have, live in a dictatorship? Would you prefer to live in North Korea or South Korea? Vote with your feet, or else we'll shoot you if okay. So I consider that science. I consider that empirical data that, and that this is the kind of bending of the arc over centuries that we've just been doing without even sort of realizing it. We've been running these experiments. Democracy is an experiment. You tweak the variables and you run the experiment for a few years, you tweak them again, and it's a never-ending process. So I think I'd call that science.
Heather?
There's so many things. I mean, so first of all, it's hard for me to understand the question. I mean, can science explain? Science is just looking, it depends on how you define science, but I mean, we're looking at evidence, okay? So if you say morality just exists out there, it's God created these rules, then yeah, we can't touch it because so far science hasn't even been able to find any evidence for God, much less what he thinks and his moral rules. So you're already, then yeah, science can't touch it. But if you're looking at morality as what kind of decisions people make, how do people behave in different, situations when there's moral dilemma, the trolley experiment or the footbridge experiment, should I sacrifice this one person to save these 5? In that sense, if you're looking at moral decisions and how humans behave, of course we can look at that via science. We can look at how the brain works. We can look at psychology. We can look at just human behavior in a variety of different contexts. The reason that we have governments and laws is because if everybody was just behaving perfectly, depending on what your moral code is, but we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need rules, we wouldn't need police, right? So it's hard to say whether we're fundamentally good or bad. We're both. It's a mix. But obviously, if there was the perfect way to be and we were all born that way, we wouldn't need laws and rules. And religion, if you look at how religion has evolved over time, it started with people, they were in these small tribes, and they were having to do rituals. And then it grew. And as populations grew, you needed a sky god to look down on people, right? To see, okay, then you had to, because it was too many people to be able to control. And so you can see, if you look at, how religion has evolved, it was to help kind of modify human behavior against our innate impulses so that we all can just get along as a society.
Yeah, go ahead,
So,
Christian.
so let me be clear again. There are parts of morality, I wouldn't call it morality strictly speaking, but certainly science can contribute lots of valuable things. It can help us understand why people made certain decisions as opposed to others. Why are they inclined in this direction as opposed to this direction? But that doesn't sound to me like morality. Morality sounds to me like questions that I have of, should I make a donation to charity, or should I keep the money and spend it on going to the movies? Should I break a promise I made to my friend? Is honesty a good thing?
Wait, I just see all these things that you're saying as decisions that need to be made. And we can look at what's happening in your brain when you're making these decisions. We can see, I can manipulate people in the lab and make them decide one way or the other based on subliminal information I'm giving them. So why are your decisions, even though they're moral decisions, outside the realm of science?
So I think we're talking past each other. So absolutely, you can do all those things. But I want to know what the right answer is.
Well, the right answer might be, say, for example, what's your goal? If your goal is to increase your sort of deeper long-term happiness, then the donation to charity will more likely produce that than whatever the other example was, buying a candy bar or something. Right. But if your goal is, I don't care about my long-term happiness, I just want to eat candy. Okay, then eat the Snickers bar. So it depends on the goal. But that's a slightly different question than like what we're talking about here, how to structure society. What's the best society? What's the most moral society in terms of expanding moral rights to include more people? Is that better than restricting some of the rights to some of the people? Something like that.
I still say the same thing.
And I think we're reading, and we are reading it off the empirical data in a sense of polls and surveys. What do people want?
So that implicitly assumes that what people want is the guide to the moral truth. We do an opinion survey, we see what people want, and therefore that tells us what the moral truth is. And that itself is not something science.
But you're assuming that there are moral truths that exist out there, and I don't know that everybody necessarily is on the same page with that. So what is your conviction that there are these absolute right and wrongs? You want to know what's the right thing to do. How do you support that conviction?
So let me say a couple things. First of all, I can give you lots of examples where it seems to me clear that there are such truths. Torturing innocent children merely for fun, that's wrong. That seems to be as clear of a truth as any truth there is. Torturing innocent children merely for fun is wrong. That is true. Setting a cat on fire for amusement.
That's true.
Wait, can I finish? Setting a cat on fire for amusement is okay. Nope. Doesn't strike me that way. And these are the kind of claims, these are ones where I think we can find lots of agreement, where it's very hard to be a relativist about claims like that. What the Nazis did to the Jews is wrong. Bam, period. So then I think about these claims, these are convictions I have, yes. In my mind, they're objective truths, so that even though the Nazis thought otherwise, they were mistaken. Nazis thought this was okay, but they're mistaken. I think we may agree with that about that. And then, so they say they're objective, but you could still be a relativist. You could say, in my opinion, what the Nazis did was wrong. But you still have moral convictions. They're just relativized to your opinion or to your society or to culture. All of us have moral convictions. I like to see, or at least psychopaths might be.
I want to shift. We could spend the rest of the evening going around and around in circles here, and I want to shift the discussion a little bit and sort of come back to the neuroscience of this, actually, because I know, Heather, you've been working on looking at particular parts of the brain that seem to trigger I guess what we would consider sort of moral responses. And I just want to figure out what does brain science tell us so far? I mean, can we look at a particular part of the brain and say, oh, that seems to generate feelings of empathy, for instance?
Yeah. I mean, I'm more looking at immoral responses, but conversely, the research that's looking at moral responses coincides nicely with what I'm finding. But then there's two questions, and then there's empathy. So empathy is great. I mean, we can see a very unique circuit in the brain light up when people are experiencing empathy. A really interesting study is that with olfaction, which is a very basic sense, we built this olfactometer so we can give people different scents in the scanner and look at what's happening when their brain is lighting up. And I'm going to talk about a study that we didn't do ourselves, but I think it's a really interesting study involving olfaction, where they collected sweat from people who were about to who were working out at the gym, so neutral sweat. They collected sweat from other people who were undergoing an anxious situation, like they were about to jump out of a plane, or they're about to take a really hard exam. And then they gave these anxious and neutral sweats to another person who consciously would smell it and claim they couldn't tell the difference between these two. And they gave them these odors then while they were in the scanner. And what they found is that even though consciously they say, oh, they smell the same, their empathy network in the brain would lit up when they smelt the anxiety sweat. So even in odor, we're picking up on things, and so that's clear. We're getting a sort of nice neural signature of a kind of empathy network. But making moral decisions is a little bit is interesting. There's no one part of the brain. Again, there's different parts that are involved in different aspects of it, of making these moral decisions. So on the one side, when I have patients who have a lesion to a part of the it's called the orbital prefrontal cortex. It's a part of the prefrontal cortex. They have difficulty, they're going for that immediate reward. They will make a decision. They can't hold their impulses, so they'll do things that maybe have very negative consequences for the future, but they just cannot seem to control themselves. There's, talking about pedophilia, there was a really sort of the modern day Phineas Gage study where this man around in his 40s developed pedophilia symptoms. They were going to put him in jail. He started getting headaches. They did an MRI. They saw a big tumor in his right orbital prefrontal cortex. They removed the tumor. Symptoms went away. He was allowed to return home where he had a young daughter. And then about a year later, the symptoms came back, and sure enough, the tumor had grown back. So it's really getting at this causation rather than just correlation.
That's a fascinating example, which obviously raises some profound philosophical questions. I mean, is that to say that he's off the hook? He's not responsible. He's got the brain tumor.
No, it leads to a lot of, exactly how much do we hold people responsible?
Well, it's a slippery slope, because you could carry that argument. I mean, in theory, everything that we do is a product of something going on in our brain. So it might not be a brain tumor, but it might be something else that would sort of push us in one direction. So are we basically sort of saying, ultimately free will goes out the window?
Yeah, well, let me just to finish up that story. The other thing is that when people are making these moral decisions, that part of the brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, lights up. So we know it is involved in making these moral decisions. So then the question becomes, yes, if you have a lesion there, if you have underactivation, or maybe a subtle abnormality or neurochemical imbalance, it can get to the point of subtle differences. And so what does that mean? Now, as a neuroscientist, I think much of the evidence suggests that free will is an illusion. This concept of free will, the brain is making decisions unconsciously all the time, or our perception of having freely decided sort of comes a little bit after the fact. There's a lot of studies done in the 80s, Benjamin Libet, and more modern studies which show that you can predict which way a person's going to go, like press a button left or right, up to 10 seconds before they're consciously aware of the intention, just by looking at brain activation. So the brain kind of gears up to make a decision, and then at some point you get the conscious intention of I'm willing this, and then you do the behavior. But there's this whole buildup beforehand. So, and again, if you tell people though that free will is an illusion, some psychology studies show that they tend to act out they act more unethically and immorally.
But what do you do with that? I mean, is this an argument for we ultimately don't really have moral responsibility?
No, of course not, because you also have free won't. You can simply override those urges.
Wait. No, but that was Benjamin Libet's argument. But a recent study came out, it was 2013 by Patrick Hagard's group at UCL, where they looked at free won't, and they had people they could move, and at any point they could then not do it. And there was still a neural precursor to the not.
But it's still your brain making the choice.
I would say you have unconscious free will, but not the consciousness comes after.
Wherever it comes from, it's still you making the choice, so you are morally culpable for your actions. On a sliding scale of degrees of freedom, most of us, most of the time, in most circumstances, are culpable and make decisions that we should be held responsible for. Yes, Mr. Oft, the guy with the brain tumor, orbital frontal cortex, or somebody with a horrific background, drug addictions, the extreme cases, yes, of course, their degrees of freedom are fewer than ours. simply by physical constraints on their brain. So, and the laws already deals with this. You know, these mitigating circumstances, crimes of passion, you know, addictions, and you know, these kinds of things, tumors, you know, horrific backgrounds. We tend not to hold them quite as responsible, and we give them, you know, different kinds of punishments for that. Well, and so I think the law has been adjusting itself according to the way the science understands the workings of the brain, while still holding us morally responsible most of the time for most people under most. Otherwise, you won't have a civil society without that.
I would argue, yes, people still have to be held responsible for their actions, but for a slightly different, not because they have free will as the classic kind of, the way we've defined free will, as you could have done otherwise in the same exact situation if everything was exactly the same, but in the sense that we have evolved the capacity to have self-control. And if you look at a person's brain, like, people are held responsible in the law. For example, a child isn't held as responsible if they commit a crime than an adult because they don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. They don't have the capacity to have self-control, or a person with brain damage in that part of the brain, or a psychiatric patient who simply can't do it. But we do have the ability to, the brain has evolved to have self-control. So we hold people responsible for their actions to the extent that they have the capacity to have self-control, which is a slightly different thing than the classic sort of Cartesian definition of free will, which according to neuroscience, we don't really have.
Christian, do you want to jump in here?
So lots to be said here. Needless to say. So I tend to side with those who believe in moral responsibility and free will as well. In the philosophical world these days, that's the majority view, and philosophers are quite well informed about this empirical research and are still holding on to both free will and moral responsibility.
Really? Most philosophers believe in free will?
So
they can't help it. I mean, they're philosophers.
Now, but there's free will and there's free will. There are different kinds of free will, different positions on the free will debate. So there's this, you were alluding to kind of Descartes position. Philosophers call it a libertarian position, nothing to do with politics. We're not going to get into that. But where it's, like you said, ability to do otherwise, this kind of ultimate responsibility rests with the agent. And then there's this other position, which is kind of called compatibilism, which says that determinism and free will can both exist side by side, and that they're, hence the name compatibilism, they're compatible with each other. And so you can have determinism at the neural level, and you can have free will and more responsibility too. And sociologically speaking, most philosophers are okay with one or other of those positions. Very few are willing to go down the path of hard determinism, which just wipes away moral responsibility and free will altogether. So I think we have some agreements here. The very tricky thing to do, though, is where to draw the line between the tumor case and the normal case. What is it specifically? So this idea of self-control, what is it specifically about self-control that grounds moral responsibility in a way that the tumor doesn't? After all, if this is just another set of processes going on in the brain, why is it a privileged set of processes as opposed to some other sets of processes that are not privileged and that take away moral responsibility? So that still needs to be sorted out more.
Isn't the scenario that we're facing 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we're going to know a whole lot more about how the brain works, about what is generating these various impulses that we have to either do good or bad, and where's that going to lead us?
Well, the law would then just make adjustments, as it has been all along. And I'll tell you a funny story. I've been testifying in this court case on a tax fraud. I know a lot about these tax scammers that are protesting. You don't have to pay income tax because 16th Amendment was never properly ratified and blah, blah, blah. One of them is that you look in the tax code, it says paying your taxes is dependent on voluntary compliance. That's the actual phrase that the IRS uses. So a lot of these tax protesters, according to Webster's dictionary, voluntary says I don't have to if I don't want to. So they actually tell them, send a letter to the IRS that says I volunteer not to comply to the. So you can imagine how many of these have been successfully zero. Anyway, so but it's the same kind of thing. Like, okay, you come up to a stop sign or a stoplight, you don't have to stop. It's voluntary compliance. But if you don't, you might get a ticket or whatever. So the state has kind of figured out, okay, we have choices. We really want you to do this, and you really better do it. And if not, we have these set of punishments ratcheting up from penalty and interest to jail, and that does presume a degree of freedom, that we are making choices, and yet, we know if we just give people complete freedom, they're not going to do it for selfish reasons. So you got to pile on the punishments, which is kind of a determinism. So there's kind of a balance.
The brain
there.
is taking information all the time from the environment, and it's making calculations. Much of this is happening outside of awareness. So, from all the way from behaviorism, we can take an animal, including humans, and with some rewards and punishers can modify their behavior accordingly. And there's a lot of the time people will, come up with these post hoc explanations about why they're doing things. Oh, I'm stopping that at that stoplight because I don't want to get killed by an oncoming car, but maybe they're really stopping because they're afraid of getting the ticket. We don't have such great insight always into what's motivating our behavior. And so to think that there's this little man inside there who's like, consciously making all these decisions, really it's the brain constantly making new calculations all the time. Now we're born with certain predispositions. Some people are more sensitive to rewards or punishments or less so. And, within those biological constraints and our innate predispositions, the brain's making calculations all the time, and also based on what you were exposed to and the way the brain is developed over the course of time and experiences as well. Mm-hmm. But all of that is feeding into the picture. So to the idea that there's this other me inside of here that can remove myself from all of that and make another decision that my brain wouldn't have otherwise made in the same exact circumstances. There's no, I find that very difficult to justify, and the evidence doesn't suggest it. And just to clarify, with the Cartesian definition of free will, it says that if everything was exactly the same, that means everything in the environment and every neuron firing in your brain was exactly firing in that exact same way, you could have done otherwise. And that means there's something else. There's a sort of ghost in the machine that could change the way things occur, which I don't think. Most neuroscientists think free will is an illusion, but I guess we differ from philosophers.
Can I go back to the cat burning thing?
Yes, just briefly.
Well, if we were on the stage, say, 200, 300 years ago, you would not have used that example. People burned cats. They used to nail them to a post, and then you had to headbutt it until it was dead before you got your eyes scratched out. This was great fun in the colonial America. Bear baiting, cockfighting, dog fighting, some of these things still go on. But we don't do the cat thing anymore. Why? Why do we not do this anymore? You would not have argued then, I claim, that we all know cat burning is wrong. Everybody would go, are you kidding me? This is great fun. I just did it last week.
So I would say similar things about slavery. Right?
Yes.
And
right,
so I would
So
say,
how do you know it's wrong now that you wouldn't have known then?
The general story would be something like, we made moral progress.
Yes, right.
And I think that we would agree to that.
Where did that come from?
That's a separate question, for sure.
I'm asking it.
Right. So it could come from, I think, a variety of different directions. It could come from religious discussions. It could come from realizing the consequences of what we've done and the harm that we're doing with these actions. It could come from conscience. I think we could speculate about a lot of different sources. But the key idea is just because in the past this was considered okay does not make it okay. And that as human beings in some areas, we've made significant moral progress where we've now come to realize that something that was done in the past is not okay now. Slavery is a paradigm example of that, but I think animal rights is another.
But you use the example of divine, divine command theory or wherever you get it. There's nothing about this from any holy book. There's been no new revelations from on high that this could have come from. I'm arguing it just came from the bottom up without any divine inspiration or holy book reinterpretation or something like that.
So, do we want to make this a theology discussion?
What? I think we've already been here with this discussion. I want to shift the discussion a little bit and come back to you, Christian,
sure.
and sort of putting on your philosophical hat
sure.
again. You work on something called the Character Project. Mm-hmm. You have talked about virtue, which
sure.
seems like a very old-fashioned word. Do we need to bring back these concepts of virtue and character? Are these meaningful in our society today?
That's a big one. I think the answer is yes, and I think they have not gone away. So contrary to the assumption of your question, I think that things have actually unfolded differently. So throughout much of the 20th century, character and virtue were cast aside in philosophical discussions, in scientific discussions. I don't know about the culture at large. And the reasons for that are multiple, one of which was the predominance of logical positivism and a strong emphasis on empirical research and a suspicion about ethical topics in general. But then there was a big shift, philosophically speaking, in the 1980s with the work of people like Alistair McIntyre and others, bringing back the concepts of virtue and character into the philosophical discussions, theological discussions, humanities discussions more generally, really transformative shift that happened in intellectual discussions of character, to the point now where philosophers are talking about virtue and character all the time. Not just philosophers, but I think many other disciplines too. Now, shifting outside of philosophy, in the broader society, I see this happening quite a bit as well. Leave aside the broad category of virtue, which might sound highfalutin and overly intellectual. We talk all the time about whether someone is honest or dishonest, right? Or loving or not, or forgiving or not, or grateful or not, compassionate or not. And that is something that's familiar to us in our discourse, and is something that we seem to really care about. Right? I want to be with someone who's trustworthy and honest and loving and caring. And when I say that, I'm talking about character. Right? I want to be with someone who's going to be loyal to me and not betray me. I'm talking about the character traits of someone else. If I'm an employer, I want to hire people with good character traits, and I want to devise tests to discern whose character traits are better than others so I can hire the best people with respect to their integrity, honesty, trustworthiness, loyalty, and so forth. So far from jettisoning these concepts, I think we actually do use them all the time, and we should continue to use them. They're, in fact, extremely valuable, and they're also correlated with all kinds of other things we care about as well, including things like lifespan, health, education, academic performance, and then the list goes on. So I'm a big fan of character. No surprise.
Agreement, disagreement?
Oh yeah,
here?
well I think what these character traits are doing is training the brain to suppress the impulses bubbling up from within. So your free won't is better, or at least at some higher level. And that's what we've been doing for centuries. Again, is developing customs and mores in which people just suppress their the nastier urges, and that has driven down rates of violence. Steven Pinker's great book, Better Angels of Our Nature, he's got that great discussion. He sort of resurrected Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Process, in which part of his database are these books of customs and table manners from the Middle Ages. Basically, you read this stuff and these people were gross. I mean, the way they ate, just stick your hands in the food, taste the meat and put it back on the platter, and it's like, don't do that. Oh, okay. Or don't stab the meat with your knife and then put the meat and then put the knife, double dipping, things like that. It's like, why do we need to be told that? Well, we have this, and so you learn to suppress those urges, and those are virtues.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to say, we're born with different, I would call them temperaments or personality traits. I mean, it's all just how you label it. It's really, how does this person tend to behave across different situations and contexts? And if a person in general behaves in a impulsive way, we say that that's part of their, and that's part of their personality. And personality is very difficult to change. It's usually constant throughout a lifetime. So you can take a baby and look at its temperament and kind of predict what kind of, pretty accurately what kind of personality traits they'll have. And that's why personality disorders are so hard to treat. And so if you look at it, it's just how you label it. So if you label somebody who has this virtue of honesty, it's just how they happen to have behaved across different situations. They tend to always behave in this way by telling the truth, and we give them that label. But, do other species have these traits? And what about children? And what do you do if somebody is just born with a certain predisposition and they can't change? They're less virtuous. Do we look at them as lesser people? And and then also just to what Michael had said, yes, we through evolution, there's certain traits that are more valued, or personality characteristics, and I think over time we've nurtured them, and those people have survived. For example, if you're really agreeable and get along, and you display signs of empathy and trustworthiness, you're going to have a lot of get along socially in a group. You're not going to be an outcast, and back in the day, you'll be able to survive more. And so we've kind of breeded these traits, but I don't think we should hold people up to they have to be at this virtuous kind of standard if you're not born with that predisposition. I find that might cause a lot of torment to certain people.
I want to throw it to the audience in just a few minutes, but I have one final question for each of you. You've all studied morality in one way or another, and I'm wondering, if this has hit home for you and in a personal way. I mean, given what you've studied, has it changed anything in your own life? I mean, Michael, you just wrote a whole book
Well,
on this.
mine's the correct one. I discovered I'm the only one I know that has free will. Yeah, I guess it's just made me reflect more, probably less personal and more sort of political, social, ideological. Think about those kinds of things. Where what direction is society going? What direction should it be going? Just to sort of look at those bigger issues from a bottom-up scientific perspective. And because I haven't really studied morality like Christian has in terms of should I be honest or not? I kind of figured that one out a while ago. For the most part, yeah, you should be honest. I think we're born with most of that. So it's for me more social, social political.
Christian, has this hit home for you personally?
Yes, in several respects. I'm a father of two wonderful boys who I miss right now a lot, and I'm thinking a lot about moral education and character development. So I take a slightly different view that I think character traits are malleable and that they can be shaped over time, and I think there's good empirical evidence of that. Work on personality traits does show change in personality traits over time, so I'm trying to think of strategies which might cultivate good traits in my children and emulate them in myself. And another personal reflection has been, I've been struck tying this all the way back to the very beginning of our discussion by the obstacles to becoming a good person. They're the kind of obvious ones that we know of, temptations that we know of in our lives, but then they're kind of subtle factors that can derail us and keep us from being at our best in different circumstances. So being in a group, the bystander effect, being in a group can prevent me from helping someone. I really didn't appreciate that until I started really digging into this empirical evidence. And now I'm trying to be much more cognizant of these subtle influences that can derail me from being the kind of person I aspire to be, which I do aspire to be a virtuous person, an honest person, a compassionate person, and so forth. But I recognize even more so than I already thought I've got a long way to go. And I'm certainly not anywhere close to that right now.
Your boys are tearing up the house while you're here. Right?
Well, hopefully they're asleep. I'm not tearing up the house.
Heather?
Yeah, so I didn't mean to be, I do obviously think we all have the capacity to change within certain limits, okay? Even if you just take someone who happens to be a very highly anxious person and you want to help them become less anxious, they can become, or, decrease a phobia, let's say, but they're never going to be the most chilled out person ever, right? So I think within your biological constraints, you can certainly strive to get to be the best, that you can be. And I totally agree with that. I think, though, within limits. And what I've learned is that, a lot of what's motivating me and driving me is happening outside of consciousness. We think we have so much conscious control over everything we do, but, we really don't. And given that, I thought, okay, well, what can I do then about this? Well, I think, and the advice that I, give to people, especially people who are dealing with issues of, they can't control their impulses and they really wish they could, or their, compulsive behavior or their addictions, is that the more we are in tune with our sort of unconscious motivations and desires, the more we can kind of look inward and bring those to the surface, the more we can kind of structure our lives to understand our predilections and kind of, avoid them. So if you have a sweet tooth, then, just know that about yourself. Don't put sweet things in the house. Don't tempt yourself. If you're someone who tends to be unfaithful or a cheater, don't put yourself in situations that there's going to be temptation there. So I think, rather than, it's harder to change the impulses, but what we can change is how we respond to them to a certain extent. So, depending if you have a fully healthy functioning brain, I tend to like, let's say, alcohol, and I know that maybe I drink too much. Don't put yourself in that situation. So the urge to drink might still be there. You might not be able to change that, but you can perhaps change how you behave. And that's so through science, I've kind of come to that understanding to accept these impulses, not necessarily try to change them, but you can change your environment.
Okay, I am willing to bet that we have a few questions or comments here.
I think it is. So here's how I'd take it on the abstract level as a philosopher, and then maybe others can make it more tangible and practical. So Aristotle is the go-to person for discussion of character and what's good. And he said that a good person performs the right actions reliably, consistently, but also from the appropriate motivation, from virtuous motivation. So that being a good person involves action that's virtuous and motivation that's virtuous. a nice person, I have questions about both the action and the motivation until I know more about what this person's character is like. So I can imagine a nice person who does lots of wrong actions. Sounds like in your example, they were willing to go along and do some bad actions or wrong actions. But I can also imagine a nice person who does lots of good things, but not necessarily from the best motives. Maybe does them for more self-seeking, self-interested, self-seeking reasons, as opposed to altruistic or more virtuous kinds of reasons. So that's how I would understand a good person who has a character which is both virtuous in motivation and virtuous in action. And you need both of those. And a nice person, not necessarily either. That's the philosopher's answer.
So the science can't, in a sense, prove a negative, or, I mean, we can, what it does is it chips away at what we, so certainly we don't have all the answers, and there's much that we don't understand. And there's this whole, philosophy of the God of the gaps, right? It's like what we don't understand, that's where we would kind of place God. And as science started to explain it, then God would kind of shift over to the other part that we can't explain. Now, like with neuroscience, there's a whole, there's a whole area of where people are saying, okay, it's at the quantum level, that's where free will kind of fits in, and we're trying to, and then once science can sort of explain that, then it'll find another place to go to. So I don't know that we can't ever prove that it doesn't exist. But all I can say is that the evidence so far, there's been no evidence to show that it does. But there's always the possibility. And I can never say with certainty. I can never say with certainty that there is no God. I don't know. I just haven't seen any evidence. I would love there to be an afterlife, and I can live on eternity and all that. I think that's great. I would go for it, but I still haven't seen any evidence yet. So as a scientist with my scientific mind on, I'm just looking at what the evidence has shown so far, with the open of anything is possible, of course.
One thing I think she might be asking is, so like with the Benjamin Libet experiment, so this part of your brain says, I'm now aware of it, and here's the motor neurons that fire it 3 seconds before, which she's asking, well, then what's below that? Right. Turtles all the way down, or what? I mean, what?
Right.
So this is how it kind of works. I mean, without getting too neuroscience-y, but basically you're having stimuli coming into the brain, information, and it's setting these neurons off and they're firing. And at a certain point, and they're all communicating with each other. And at a certain, like with the Libet experiment, they say, just, lift up your finger whenever you feel it, whenever you get the urge or whatever, and let me just know when you get the urge. But they already have something implanted that I should at some point decide to lift up my finger. So the brain's kind of in a ready state. And then the neurons kind of hit a tipping point. And when it hits this tipping point, it's called the readiness potential. It's kind of like edging up, and it hits a tipping point, and then it goes, okay, we're going to make this decision. And then a whole group of neurons start firing together, and then there's this whole coordinated response, and which leads to the action. So it's not like it's coming completely out of nowhere. It's coming from, there's input, there's also internal information that's coming in, and at some point it reaches kind of like a tipping point, and it pushes you to go in one direction or another. But the conscious feeling of I'm intending that comes just a little bit, 300 milliseconds after the fact that the brain has already decided to go in that direction. But I think that basically there's a lot of things we don't know, as I said, but in terms of simply brain function and consciousness, I mean, from the material world and what we understand from science, your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions are intimately connected to neurons firing in the brain. If I damage you I have patients who have brain lesion. You have a damage to a certain part of your brain, it changes your personality, or it changes your memories, or you have no memories, or, so it's this intimate connection, and it's not just correlation, it's causation. We can go in now with electrodes, we can stimulate specific neurons and have someone create a memory in a person, or a specific thought. We can activate that. There's something called optogenetics now, where they can actually use light and trigger specific circuits in the brain and get a rat to go this way or that way. I mean, there's certainly an intimate connection between our thoughts, our experiences, our emotions, and the brain neurons firing. Is there something else? I don't know what that magic substance is. I mean, of course, there's a possibility for that, but that gets into the non-physical realm at some level, or it could be at the quantum mechanical realm, perhaps, and that's where people are going now. But that doesn't buy us back conscious free will.
Well, we're a social primate species, so to get along, you have to have some kind of rules and guidelines and moral emotions that help us interact in a reasonably frictionless way that doesn't lead to the complete collapse of the group, the extinction of the group. So, that's what the moral emotions are for. Now, we don't have to continue to expand the moral sphere to include everybody. We don't have to. It's not inevitable. It is the direction we've been going, and this is fortunate, and it's not likely to go backwards, but it could. So there's nothing teleological about it. We're not, endlessly going to expand it, so it's perfect. But still, it's a worthy goal, and I think one of the things we've all grasped, back to the cat burning thing, is that wouldn't feel good if it happened to me. And we've expanded our empathy circuits a bit. Empathy is not perfect, but it's a way of getting us to put our minds into somebody else's head and mind read them. And we're better at that. Literature, film, just in all kinds of ways that trick the brain into caring about somebody else. I call this the Ndugu effect, from that wonderful Jack Nicholson film about Schmidt, where he adopts that little African kid, Ndugu, when he's channel surfing late one night. Well, there's a real effect there. And NGOs and nonprofits know that if you show a picture of 10,000 starving kids, you'll get X number of dollars donation. If you show one kid with a name, you'll get 3-4 times the amount of donations, because it tricks the brain into making little Ndugu an honorary member of my family and friends that I should care about. And that's what we've been doing. That's the goal, if there's a goal.
I think it's really important. I was going to bring up animals as well, because so there's a lot of similarities and there are differences. But the thing is, scientific evidence suggests that other animals have consciousness, so they have feelings. They can feel pleasure and pain. They might not have language, but you don't really need language or even self-awareness to have basic subjective experiences like sensation. So once you say the burning cat, if the cat can't feel pain consciously, then what does it really matter if we burn it? So if we started thinking about AI, let's say we get a human, if you've seen this recent movie Ex Machina, they have this humanoid person. She acts and looks as if she's feeling, and is it okay to punch her in the head? Is that okay? Well, it only matters if she can consciously feel pain or not. That's where we draw the moral line. So with animals, if you take that premise, yeah, they can feel pain. Now, there's been some studies with monkeys where they look at fairness, right? So they show them one monkey does a task, they give the experimenter a rock and he gets a cucumber, and the other monkey, they can see each other. The other monkey does the same task, but that monkey gets a grape, which is way better than a cucumber. So now the next monkey, the cucumber monkey, does his thing again, and now he gets a cucumber and he throws it back. He's like, no, I want the grape. So they get the concept of fairness, But can they have these, more higher, virtuous things? No, and are we don't hold them responsible? Same thing with children as well. Can they withhold an immediate, pleasure to do something that's going to help somebody else? And if they can't, are they less moral, or is it just they don't have the capacity to do that? So anyway, there are some elements of making or at least fairness, or, those kinds of judgments in other animals, but not completely. But we do know that they can feel something. So there's been studies certainly looking at what happens in the brain when people are making moral decisions. So stuff by Green at Princeton, Josh Green, he's did work where, for example, a trolley experiment, have 5 people in a trolley and it's going on a track and I think it's going to crash, or you can pull a lever and change its course and save the 5 people, but then there's some other workman on the tracks and you're going to kill him. So, right, what's the moral decision? Well, most people would pull the lever and kill the person and save the 5. However, if it's something that's emotionally salient, so now let's say you're on a footbridge and there's a big hefty guy there and you could physically push him down to stop the trolley from crashing. So again, you're still killing one person and saving the 5. Most people wouldn't do that because it's the same calculation, but there's an emotional reaction. But they're looking at what happens in the brain when people are making these decisions, and you get this ventral medial prefrontal activation, you get some amygdala activation and some other areas, but this is different than the free will, where it's the timing is at such a small scale, you can't really look. Making a moral decision, it takes a longer period of time of activation in the brain. I'm sure that if you can look at it the scale that Libet did, if you look at individual neurons firing, you're going to have a buildup before that decision is made at some level. But you're looking at larger circuits. It's very complex. It's not like there's just one place that you can look at and say, oh, what's the timing of that? And when does that fire? And, are people conscious of their decision?
So the question is there a free will dimension here to this question?
It's the same kind of situation. The brain is making these calculations. And so research has shown that if there's an emotional aspect, so if you start activating emotional centers of the brain will make a different kind of rational decision. So both those decisions were rationally the same, right? Save 5 people, kill 1. But the brain calculates it differently depending on the input it's getting from the amygdala. And they even show these moral decisions, the more connectivity there is between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the more the emotional aspect of the decision. So, for example, a psychopath, in some sense, where they lack the emotion, they make more rational decisions. So they would just push that person and make the more rational decision, not being motivated by these emotions, which can get in the way sometimes.
We could go on, but we are out of time. Thank you so much, all of you who've come. Thank you to our panelists.